Good evening, folks, and welcome to the UK Parliament's Pride in the Parliamentary Archives online talk. My name is Felix. I'm a visitor assistant and tour guide at the UK Parliament, and I'm here to introduce the event. Now, in a second, I shall be passing over to the wonderful Penny, our outreach archivist, who will be exploring some key documents from the Parliamentary Archive, giving us insight in some interesting LGBT plus stories and showing us how these documents reflect changing attitudes, both within Parliament and society in general. Now, it is important for me to mention that on occasion, you will hear language that doesn't necessarily line up with modern day parlance, and today is definitely not acceptable, but please be assured that we're using it in its original context and no offence is at all intended. This language is used, it's very much of its time and is used as a means of unpacking and understanding some key elements of queer history within the UK legislature as a whole. Now, as is the case with a lot of history, we have to contend with a male-dominated account of the past when it comes to examining LGBT plus aspects of parliamentary history. And as a result, a lot of reading between the lines has to take place in order to uncover this hidden, but altogether fascinating, if not at times very tragic, narrative. Unfortunately, though, due to the inclinations of these privileged authors of both the documents we'll be examining and the history we'll be looking at, a lot of what's going to be discussed this evening leads more heavily towards the G and the B of LGBT plus than other parts. Hopefully, however, through future research and igniting interest through public events like this, we can redress this imbalance. Now, before I pass you over to Penny, I just want to point out there is a chat box towards the bottom right of your screen where you can type up your questions throughout the event, and they'll be queued up by our moderators to be answered at the end during a 10-minute Q&A session. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. But we must also ask you to remember that due to the nature of mine and Penny's job, we must remain politically impartial at all times. You can also see that in the announcements section, we have posted a link to a survey, and we would absolutely love it if you could fill this in at the end, because we appreciate all forms of feedback. They help us in creating the best possible public events we can make. And as an added bonus, you'll get 15% off in our online shop for filling one out, so not too shabby. So without further ado, here's Penny.
Thanks, Felix, and thanks everyone for joining us virtually today. This talk has been created from tours that the Parliamentary Archives gives of our LGBT plus documents. I find that one of the most interesting aspects of the tours is the reaction from the audience members to the various documents and what they mean to them. I'd like to try and recreate this with your help if you feel comfortable. I encourage you to anonymously share your thoughts, feelings and stories about these documents on the Teams chat, and our moderators can publish these for everyone to see throughout the event. Attraction has always existed between both women and women and men and men. What I'm exploring today is how this is evidenced in our archive collections. The Parliamentary Archive collects, preserves and makes accessible the records of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Our records begin in 1497 and we are still collecting to this day. Finding LGBT plus records is a complicated task for many reasons, primarily because how society and the individuals themselves views and interprets gender identity and same-sex attraction has changed significantly over time. Another reason that searching for LGBT plus records is difficult is the evolving language used to describe gender identity and same-sex attraction. Often, instead of looking for words that describe gender identity and same-sex attraction, we have to look for words used to describe same-sex sexual acts and descriptions of cross-dressing, which leads me to the first record that I'll be discussing today. An Act for the Punishment of the Vice of Buggery, or the Buggery Act as it came to be known, was passed in 1533 during the reign of King Henry VIII. The Act did not explicitly target sex between men, as it also applied to sodomy between men and women and a person with an animal. Convictions between men for sodomy were by far the most common and well publicised. Convictions under the Buggery Act 1533 were punishable by death. This law outdated sodomy in Britain and by extension what would become the British Empire. Previous to this legislation, punishment for sodomy was governed by ecclesiastical courts. An ecclesiastical court is one that is set up by a religious authority. Bypassing these courts was the first step in justifying the dissolution of the monasteries and the seizure of their lands. Initially, the Buggery Act was only temporary, but was extended after an extensive inquiry into the sexual lives of England's monks and nuns, essentially seeing if they broke their vows of chastity. The results of this inquiry were used to justify the dissolution of the monasteries and became part of the story by which Protestant England justified its breach with Rome. Criminalising same-sex acts was used as a way to push Henry VIII's agenda of distancing England from the Catholic Church. For over 400 years, this Tudor law remained in place, sentencing men who wanted to have sex with other men to death. This law affected all classes of men. However, if you were wealthy and powerful enough, you could avoid the death penalty and even jail time. This was the case for William Banks MP. William Banks MP is in the corner here in this painting of the House of Commons. In 1833, Banks was arrested for engaging in indecent behaviour with a soldier in a urinal outside the Houses of Parliament. He says his actions had been misconstrued and he denied the charges. Many noblemen, including the Duke of Wellington, testified to his good character. When the principal witness failed to appear, Banks was acquitted. Banks retired from public life. Everything was going well until 1841, when Banks was again arrested for indecent behaviour with a guardsman, this time in Green Park near Wellington Barracks. On this occasion, Banks forfeited a £5,000 bond and fled the country. Banks was officially declared an outlaw, but before this came into effect, he managed to sign over all his property to his relatives, so his estate was not forfeited to the Crown. Banks first went to France and then settled down in Italy, where he died in 1855. The legacy of this legislation continued for many centuries, as Banks demonstrates, and men could still be put to death for having sex with other men until 1861. The 19th century witnessed an unprecedented rise in the number of men punished for having sex with each other. Between 1806 and 1900, 404 men were sentenced to death for having sex with a man. 56 of these men were executed, and the rest died in prison or were transported to Australia. In 1861, the Offences Against the Person Act replaced the death penalty for buggery with life imprisonment. A further change in the law followed when Liberal MP Henry Labuschagne introduced a clause to the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1855. Labuschagne's amendment, as it came to be known, stated that any male persons who in public or private commits any act of gross indecency with another male person shall be guilty of a misdemeanour and could be punished with up to 2 years in prison. What gross indecency actually means was never specified, but the courts seem to have used it to describe consenting acts which fell short of sodomy. This was how it was used to prosecute Oscar Wilde. This is a photograph of Oscar Wilde with his lover. Oscar Wilde is a famous author to this day. He was tried and imprisoned in 1895 for acts of gross indecency. He was released in 1897, serving the full 2 years of his sentence. Wilde's health had diminished in prison and continued to do so on his release. Oscar died in Paris in the year 1900. So far in this talk, I have not mentioned any records referencing female same-sex attraction. This is because there was no legislation outlawing a woman having sex with another woman. In 1921, it was proposed that any act of gross indecency between female persons shall be a misdemeanour and punishable in the same way as any such act committed by male persons under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885. The bill got through the Commons but fell in the House of Lords. This was the first time that lesbianism was explicitly discussed, although not named, in Parliament. The following extracts are from the House of Lords debate. The Earl of Malmesbury. My lord, I am extremely sorry to raise a discussion upon what must be, to all of us, a most disgusting and polluting subject. I very much regret that circumstances over which the committee who sat to consider these bills had no control have compelled me to raise this subject today and to move that this House do not agree with this amendment. The disdain displayed by the Earl of Malmesbury was mirrored by the Earl of Desart, who said, "It's very disagreeable talking of these things, but we all know of the sort of romantic, almost hysterical friendships that are made between young women at certain periods of their lives and of its occasional manifestations." The Earl goes on to say, "You may say that there are a number of them, but it would be, at most, an extremely small minority. And you are going to tell the whole world that there is such an offence, to bring it to the notice of women who have never heard of it, never thought of it, never dreamt of it. I think that is a very great mischief, and I came here determined to do all I could to help my noble friend Lord Malmesbury to get this clause removed from the bill." What this debate, I think, shows is the paternalistic attitude towards women by men in Parliament at the time. That there is no need to legislate, as unlike men who have sex with men, women who have sex with women are not seen as a threat. There is also speculation that the addition of the amendment to punish an act of gross indecency between female persons was a political move to kill the whole bill, as they knew that the thought of legislating female attraction would be so abhorrent that the bill would not be passed. Conversely, women were banned from certain spaces in Parliament, and before 1918, women could not vote or become MPs, and it was not until 1958 that women could become members of the House of Lords. This increased during the suffragette protests in the early 20th century, and women were banned from spaces such as Central Lobby in Parliament precisely because they were a threat. Examples of their direct action included chaining themselves to statues. The archive holds a police report that details the arrest of a suffragette named Catherine Wilson, who dressed as a man to gain access to Central Lobby. On the 16th of March 1914, Catherine entered Parliament dressed as a man with a male companion and made her way to Central Lobby. Special Branch had alerted the Parliamentary police to be on alert to detect a woman dressed as a man. Inspector Rogers writes that, "I had my doubts about her sex. She was then arrested after the police found a riding whip hidden in her left overcoat sleeve and subsequently sentenced to 6 weeks hard labour." This is the first and only instance of cross-dressing in Parliament that I've been able to find in the archives. What it demonstrates is that it is difficult to put modern labels such as transgender on Catherine or other women who cross-dress to gain access to male spaces, as their motivation behind this could exclude gender identity. Women for centuries before Catherine have dressed as men to access male spaces that they would otherwise have been excluded from. I find Catherine Wilson to be a very intriguing person. Her real name was Clara Lambert. Catherine Wilson was an alias. She was also known to have used the name Mary Stuart. She passionately campaigned for equal franchise and was arrested on many occasions. However, when the Women's Police Service, the WPS, was created in 1915, she was one of the first to join. While working with the WPS, Catherine met Violet Louise Croxford. Catherine and Violet set up a refuge for unfortunate ladies in 1926 in a boarding house in Hythe, Kent, and then retired together to Farncombe, Surrey. There has been speculation over Catherine's and Violet's relationship, but without the women confirming it and describing themselves as lesbians or inverts, to use the 20th century term, it is impossible to know for sure. It is easier to research attraction between men precisely because it was illegal, and we have trial records that put forward evidence of this attraction. In the 1950s, there were several high-profile trials and prosecutions of men for having sex with other men. Court cases involving sodomy, gross indecency, and indecent assault had risen from 719 in the year of 1938 in England and Wales to 2,504 in the year of 1955. Most of all was the prosecution in 1954 of Lord Edward Montagu, his cousin Michael Pitt Rivers, and the journalist Peter Wildeblood. The case revolved around Lord Montagu's country estate in Hampshire. Wildeblood, Pitt Rivers and Montagu were charged with sodomy, attempted sodomy and gross indecency with RAF men Edward McNally and John Reynolds. Pitt Rivers and Wildeblood were further accused of having had sex with each other. The case rested on the selective use of McNally and Reynolds' evidence. Only 3 of the men they mentioned were ever charged, suggesting that the police were particularly keen to follow through a prosecution on the most high-profile figures. This is a change from the Victorian circumstances, where the richer you were, the more you could physically distance yourself from being prosecuted, as we saw with the William Banks case. Queer men were vulnerable to blackmail, theft and violence, and were unlikely to get much sympathy both from the public at large and the justice system. The Church of England focused on such misery and anxiety in their publication, The Problem of Homosexuality. The resulting report of 1954 advocated the legalisation of sex between consenting men. They concluded that, as it stood, the law led to blackmail and suicide, as epitomised by the life and death of Alan Turing. Alan Turing is the father of computer science and artificial intelligence. As well as being a war hero, he was convicted by the Lubuschi Amendment in 1952 and subsequently underwent chemical castration. The conviction meant that Alan Turing lost his security clearance. Security clearance and sexuality were linked, as homosexuals at the time were routinely blackmailed. This meant that they were seen as a security risk and could not work on sensitive projects. Turing took his own life in 1954, the same year that this report was published and the same year of the Montagu, Wildeblood and Pitt Rivers trial. A committee was formed later that year to investigate homosexual offences and prostitution. The committee was chaired by John Wolfenden, Vice-Chancellor of Reading University. The committee heard evidence from 200 organisations and individuals, including the armed forces and the police. Much of the evidence focused on ideas about corruption, contagion, treachery and misery. It heard evidence from only 3 acknowledged homosexuals. They were all men, highly educated and middle class, one of whom was Peter Wildeblood. The report was published in 1957 and became known as the Wolfenden Report. The recommendations were based on the premise that it should be the job of the law to preserve public order and protect the weak from exploitation. On this basis, it suggested the tightening of provisions against street prostitutes and those who used them, but advocated the relaxation of the laws on homosexual offences. It recommended that consensual homosexual acts between adults over 21 should be decriminalised, that buggery should be reclassified from a felony to a misdemeanour, and that offences which were more than 12 months old should not be prosecuted, except in the case of indecent assault. It also called for further research into the causes and treatment of homosexuality and suggested that oestrogen treatment be made available to all prisoners who wanted access to it. When the report came out, it was a bestseller and had to be reprinted. The government, however, set the report aside and did not act on the recommendation to decriminalise. When the committee was set up during the second Winston Churchill government, it was likely that they expected the report to recommend stricter legislation on homosexual relationships, rather than decriminalisation. It was not until the 27th of July 1967, a decade later, that the Sexual Offences Act decriminalised sex between 2 consenting adults over the age of 21 in private. The Act did not apply to Scotland, Northern Ireland or the Channel Islands, and homosexual sex remained illegal in the Merchant Navy and the Armed Forces. Understandably, there was many in the gay community that felt that this reform did not go far enough. There was a new defiant mood, and that culminated in the creation of activist groups such as the Gay Liberation Front, the GLF, whose manifesto listed a number of immediate demands covering equality under the law, the end to workplace discrimination, the reform of sex education in schools, and the right for gay people to be free to hold hands and kiss in public. The GLF was behind the first gay pride in London in 1972. The The campaign groups highlighted the discrepancies between England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. The 1967 Sexual Offences Act was extended to Scotland 13 years later in 1980 and Northern Ireland in 1982. The 1970s saw the first openly lesbian MP. Maureen Colquhoun was elected to Parliament in 1974. She lived in Surrey and was married to her husband Keith and had 3 children. By 1976, Maureen had moved to London with her partner Barbara Todd and was the first openly lesbian MP. She was also the first MP to be asked to be called Ms., as you can see from the following extract. Mr. Speaker, I intend to call the Honourable Member for Northampton North, Ms. Colquhoun, who has made a request to me not to be called either Mrs. or Miss, but Ms. I had better give my ruling that this is pronounced Ms. Ms. Colquhoun. I'm delighted that you are in the chair, Mr. Speaker, to give your individual Welsh pronunciation of Ms. I find it quite delicious and I thank you very much. While Maureen Colquhoun was an MP, she fought for the rights of women, proposing the Balance of the Sexes Bill and Protection of Prostitutions Bill. In 1981, the US Centre of Disease Control reported that 5 young gay men had died from a rare form of pneumonia in Los Angeles. The news came as St Mary's Hospital in London found immune cell abnormalities in blood samples from 100 gay men. In July 1982, 37-year-old Terry Higgins, a Hansard reporter, became the first known person in the UK to die of AIDS-related disease at St Thomas's Hospital in London. Before AIDS was coined in 1982, the disease had been called gay cancer or GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Press coverage of gay lifestyle and AIDS in the 1980s was unsympathetic and homophobic. It directly influenced the alarm that was being felt by the British public towards the AIDS epidemic and the gay community as a whole. Many felt that the insertion of Clause 28 into the 1988 Local Government Act was the government's reaction to AIDS. Clause 28 says, a local authority shall not A. intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, B. promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. The legislation was virtually unworkable and no prosecutions were brought. But the measure reflected a broader shift in public opinion and general disapproval towards homosexual relationships after the outbreak of AIDS in the UK. The clause specifically delegitimised lesbian and gay households and those bringing up children. At the forefront of the gay fight back was Stonewall, formed by actors Michael Cashman, now Lord Cashman, and Sir Ian McKellen. The founders were acutely aware that none of the existing campaign groups were talking directly to government about Clause 28, the age of consent, immigration, adoption and parenting, housing rights, and partnership recognition. They sought to establish a tightly organised and professionally run body to lobby on these and other key issues. Section 28 was repealed in 2003, and Prime Minister David Cameron apologised for the legislation on behalf of the Conservative Party in 2009. One of the many Stonewall objectives was to have equal age of consent for homosexual relationships. This is a speech given on the 13th of April 1999 by Lord Wahid Ali, one of the few openly gay Muslim politicians in the world. Lord Ali, my lords, many of your lordships will know that I am openly gay. I am 34. I was gay when I was 24, when I was 21, when I was 20, when I was 19, when I was 18, when I was 17, and even when I was 16. I have never been confused about my sexuality. I have been confused by the way I am treated as a result of it. The only confusion lies in the prejudice shown, some of it tonight, and much of it enshrined in the law. Age of consent equality, however, did not happen until 2001 in England, Scotland, and Wales. It took a further 8 years for it to be introduced in Northern Ireland. In 2004, the Civil Partnership Act was passed. Same-sex couples could, from the 5th of December 2005, register a civil partnership which has almost the same legal effects, rights and obligations as a marriage for mixed-sex couples. The shortcomings of this act were noted and campaign groups successfully lobbied the government. The Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act was passed in 2013, and same-sex couples can now get married in a religious ceremony. In 2019, the right to have a civil partnership was extended to heterosexual couples. We now come to the first piece of trans legislation that I know about, the Gender Recognition Act 2004. The Act came into force in April 2005. It allowed trans people whose birth was registered in the UK to have their acquired or affirmed gender recorded on their birth certificate. When the Gender Recognition Act was drafted, it was the first gender recognition legislation in the world not to require individuals to have undergone surgical sterilisation prior to recognition in their acquired gender. At this time, it was thus considered to be world leading. This legislation is now considered by many to be outdated, and further reform has been requested. The Equality Act 2010, for the first time, gave transsexual people explicit protection in their own right in Great Britain against discrimination. The UK thereby became one of a small group of countries to have passed such legislation. Protection for transsexual people was achieved by means of Section 7 of the Act, which refers to the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. Parliament now celebrates same-sex relationships, as can be seen through the commissioning of the artwork, The Wolfenden Report. Artist Jez Dolan translated the original 1957 Wolfenden Report into Polari. Polari was a coded language that men used to communicate with other men they were attracted to and to talk freely about their lifestyles. The language had its roots in the 1800s, but was popularised by Kenneth Williams in the Radio 4 programme Round the Horn in the 1960s. What this artwork symbolises for me is the change in legislation and society from same-sex relationships being punishable by death with the Buggery Act to being celebrated in an artwork commissioned by Parliament. This has been a quick look into some of the fascinating documents held in the Parliamentary Archives. In the chat box, we're posting a link to the Archives website and our social media accounts so that you can learn more about our vast collections and keep up to date with what we are doing.
Thank you very much, Penny. Now we're going to be moving on to the Q&A section of our event. I want to give thanks to everyone who has already sent in questions. Feel free to send some in now. Now we're hoping to get through as many as possible. Now just give Penny a chance to sort of sift through them a little bit. I'll start us off with the first couple. So let's just have a quick look at the chat box here, the published ones. Okay, so there's one here. It says, are there any other Pride events or tours taking place? Well, before we're in the midst of a global pandemic, we did actually have a Pride of Parliament tour as a regular fixture. Now, when things get back to normal, we'll probably be sort of doing those again. So please keep an eye on our website, parliament.uk/visit, for more information. Also, information is provided in our newsletter if you do want to sign up to that. Let's just have a look at some of the other ones here. That's a good question here. Who can I get in contact with at Parliament to talk about current LGBT plus issues in Parliament? That's a very good question there. Well, as with any sort of issues taking place in your local area, you can contact your local MP. So all of their email addresses are available on our website. And when things get back to normal as well, when the House of Commons are in session, you can actually go into the building and lobby your local MP in person. Now, sometimes you might have to wait a bit, and if they're unavailable, they have to send you an email or write you a letter. Alternatively, on Fridays, they do tend to hold local surgeries. You can also contact members of our upper house, the House of Lords, as well. Now, members of the House of Lords don't, unlike members of the Commons, don't represent a particular region of the UK, but they do represent an area of expertise. Now, and that's why some of them have been appointed. On our website, we do actually break them down according to their expertise. So if you do have any questions, concerns about LGBT plus issues, you can send an email to peers who are actually, such as Lord Cashman, whom Penny mentioned in the talk. Yeah, you can send them an email and their addresses are available on our website. You can also contact ParliOut, a workplace equality network within Parliament. They'll be able to answer questions about their work within Parliament and help direct you to other people if needed. We'll link their webpage in the doobly-doo, the chat box over there. Make sure to follow them on Twitter as well at ParliOut. So that's probably enough from me there. So I'll just hand you, now that Penny's probably had a chance to sort of go through the chat box, hand you back over to Penny.
Oh, thanks, Felix. I'm just having a look. So somebody has asked, and sorry, I was a bit distracted there, Felix, to let me know if you've already asked this one. Did I hear correctly that women were banned from the House of Lords until 1958? Yes, women did not sit in the House of Lords until after 1958. There was a really important case that was won in the 1920s by Lady Rhondda, where she was promised a seat, but it never really came to anything. So it wasn't until the 1950s. What is your favourite, most interesting document relating to LGBT in the archives? I think my favourite one is the Church of England pamphlet, The Problem of Homosexuality. And that is my favourite because I would not have suspected that the Church of England would have been asking for decriminalisation of same-sex relationships in the 1950s. So I quite like that it kind of proves my presumptions wrong. And I think that's why I like archives, is that if you actually look at some of the history and what people were saying, it kind of goes against kind of what you think might have happened. What else have we got? As the 1533 Buggery Act was on the statute books for hundreds of years in the UK, did this form the basis of laws in British colonies abroad? Yes, is the answer, sadly. Our legislation was kind of exported with a lot of stuff to do with the empire. So yeah, I think is the answer. Can I visit the archives? Yes, but not right now, not during the pandemic. So we're not kind of open, but just now, but under normal circumstances, we are open Monday to Friday, 10 till 4. You just need to book an appointment and let us know what you would like to look at, and we will get that out for you. Our email address that you can contact us on is in the chat box. So yeah, please get in touch if you're interested in looking at anything. So there's a really interesting question here that reads, if the research was into nuns too, why was there no law against actions between women? Were none uncovered, admitted perhaps, or was it not thought as serious? I think, and this is my interpretation of the history, but I think it just wasn't thought of as serious because it was very difficult for women to have power at this time. Got one from here. Alice, it's always shocking hearing the dates upon which same-sex relationships became legal, given how recent it was. When did it become legal in the Crown dependencies? I don't know the answer to that one. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer, but that is a good question and I will definitely look it up. If you want to email us, archives@parliament.uk, I will definitely look that up for you. Monarchs often use Westminster Hall to show off their concert. Is there evidence that James I or Queen Anne brought their favourites to Parliament? I don't know, is the answer. Felix? Do you know?
Let's have a look. Well, let's have a look at the question. I think in short, let's.
Will I read it out again?
Not necessarily Parliament. I mean, at that point in history, James I was very much based in the Palace of Whitehall rather than Westminster. So it was probably more sort of more sort of scandalous history took place there. Now, the only part of that where it does survive above ground there is the banqueting hall, which again is somewhere you can visit today. But I'm afraid I couldn't really sort of expand on that any more.
Sorry, thank you for covering that. How can I access the records? So you can visit the Parliamentary Archives. Obviously, that is not possible right now, but we are able to supply you with digital copies. So if you're interested, please email us. We want as many people to see our records as possible, so we're very keen for people to look at them. And then we've got one last one here from Charlie, which says, was the law that was introduced in Henry VIII's time enforced between then and Victorian times, or did it fade out of use once abolition of the monasteries was achieved? If the latter, was why it was picked up again centuries later? So there's actually another, it was kind of enforced again under the reign of Elizabeth I. So it was always on the books. So the initial legislation was only for a couple of years. It was temporary, but it was extended by later legislation. And I think what actually happened during the Victorian times is that there was more of a police force came into being. So these laws that maybe were only being used for political means were actually kind of affecting people more, and that's why you see kind of changes in the Victorian times, that they had been on the books and they were kind of used every so often. I hope that answers the question. Oh, there's more. It's interesting, the language used in the clause 28, promote homosexuality. It is interesting. I think the one that really gets me is the phrase pretended, is the use of the word pretended family relationship, which I think is interesting. I think that's all the questions. If I hand over to you, Felix.
Excellent. All right, thank you very much. So that concludes our event this evening, and thank you all for coming, and also a massive thank you to Penny for being our special guest speaker this evening. Before we end the event, I just wanted to remind you to fill in our survey at the end, and as I mentioned at the beginning, you will get a code for 15% off our online gift shop. Also, if you liked this event, we also have some more free online talks coming up. We've got some more links in the chat box over there. So for instance, all these very much actually celebrate the 150 years of the Palace of Westminster, where the UK Parliament is based today, and includes an online tour of the palace, a talk from members of our heritage team about some of the historic furniture within the Palace of Westminster, and also a talk from our wonderful tour guides about the suffrage movement. So thanks to each and every one of you for joining this talk today, and please do stay in touch by subscribing to our newsletter and being the first to hear about new events and visits such as this. And there's also another link in the chat box over there. So I and Parliament hope to see you again very soon. Thank you very much, folks.